And thank you, everybody, for coming today. What I'm going to be presenting and talking about is a portion of my dissertation research. And while Betty is here, I should mention that TCD was kind enough to fund me to present this at a conference. So thank you very much for that. This is looking at a system that is complex socio-environmental economic system that centers around Lake Victoria, and my particular interest has been in the fishery systems that exist in this lake. And what I'm going to be talking about today is just a portion of the lake off the southern shore in Tanzania called Mwanza Gulf. So a little bit of geographical context. Lake Victoria, by surface area, is the world's second largest freshwater lake. From any map you've seen, any satellite imagery, it looks like a small inland sea, because it is. However, it's a bit deceptive in that roughly 70,000 square kilometers of surface area, the average depth is only about 40 meters. And its deepest point, the entire lake, is only 80 meters. And for a human being, that's obviously quite deep, but for a lake that covers such a large surface area, it's a very shallow lake. The lake itself is shared by 3 East African countries, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. And about 35 million people live in the watershed. And the watershed that drains to the lake also includes portions of Rwanda and Burundi. So here is East Africa, Lake Victoria, pretty easy to spot. It's the real big one. When we zoom in, this is what the lake looks like. This is not quite the entire lake. This is just the Tanzanian portion, but you can see the international boundaries between Uganda and Kenya there as well. And the study that I'm going to be talking about today, the research I'll be sharing with you, again, is on Mwanza Gulf, which is this large arm that extends off the southern edge of the lake. And zooming in again a bit, this is what it looks like. So there are 2 arms where it forks at its southern edge, and extends for about 50 kilometers off of the edge of the lake, starting at the mouth of the Gulf where Mwanza City is, and that's going to be relevant because that's where a fair amount of this research has occurred. So this is a good example of what the landscape looks like in this region, with one notable exception, that this is not land. This is a picture of the open water of the lake in Mwanza Gulf, which is illustrative of one of the initial complications and environmental issues occurring in this area that piqued my initial interest in understanding what in the world was going on environmentally. This coverage is almost complete impenetrable coverage across the entire surface of the lake by a plant called the water hyacinth. If you're unfamiliar with this plant, it has interlocking, twisty roots that have bulbous air pockets in them, so it floats, and then the individual plants lock onto each other and create basically a web across the surface that is really, really hard to get anything through. So in my initial dissertation reconnaissance trips to Tanzania, everyone wanted to tell me, as soon as I said anything about environment, they're like, oh, the water hyacinth. That's the big problem. It's everywhere. It makes fishing impossible. You have to look at that. You have to talk about that. And that made sense to me, but I can't imagine that the entire environment is influenced by one single plant that lived only on the surface of the water. This is a larger ecosystem, a larger landscape that has interplay between the water and land, between rural and urban areas. There had to be more going on. So my initial research question to try and understand what that was pretty simple. I was curious about what land cover change and lake change, if any, had occurred in the last 35 years on this larger landscape surrounding the entirety of Mwanza Gulf. So the way I went about approaching and trying to answer this question was through the use of some basic remote sensing techniques. I gathered satellite imagery from the Landsat satellite sensor. I chose that satellite in particular because it allows for imagery at a relatively small spatial scale, which, even though this is a few thousand square kilometers on the surface of the Earth, that is still a quite small area. So this is a really good satellite to help us observe and view a landscape at that scale. And I pulled imagery from 1984, 1999, and 2017 to try and get an idea across the time period what sort of change had occurred. While I was trying to find appropriate imagery from each of those years in the federal archives, I also looked at historical weather and climate data, particularly because I'm concerned with what's going on in the lake. If there was a particularly heavy year of precipitation, that would artificially bias the results because it would look like the lake was more full than it was. So I tried to find time points in each year that were relatively stable and the same. Once I was able to find imagery, then I ran a basic remote sensing calculation using what's called the NDVI index. For those of you that are not familiar with this index, I promise this is the only equation. It's the normalized differential vegetation index. It basically looks at the difference between infrared and red signals that the satellite is returning compared against the sum of infrared and red signals. The result of which is it shows you the relative greenness of any individual pixel in the photograph, in the imagery that is returned by the satellite. So I wanted to know what the change was. The NDVIs between each period, I calculated change where there was at least a 20% increase or 20% decrease to mark significant points of greenness on the landscape, either increasing or disappearing. So this is my initial imagery. If you haven't studied remote sensing, it probably looks weird to you. That's because this is in false color. That it's not displaying what it would actually look like to our eyes. Instead, this is also displaying the infrared bands that I need for NDVI. This is not super useful to look at by itself, but I did want to point out a few difficulties that I had while trying to find this imagery. I ended up pulling all of these images from the short dry season, which is in our summer, Tanzania's winter, in the June-July dry season period. It was the most consistent time for precipitation, and it's also really convenient for the water hyacinth because it's about halfway through its annual life cycle. So if there's going to be a presence, it's going to be there at that point in time each year. Additionally, for those of you that have studied remote sensing, or even just those of you that have lived, worked, or studied in the tropics, you can probably imagine it's the tropics. It's pretty cloudy. So I was actually originally aiming for 2000 or 2001. Could not find cloud-free imagery at that point. Tried 2002, could not find cloud-free imagery. At that point, I went backwards in time, and that's why we have 1999. And that's the reason that there's not exactly the same time increments here. It was just a factor of what imagery was available and usable for the things that I was trying to investigate. So these are what happens when you calculate the NDVI. These are simply a representation. The lighter and darker images are how green or not green the surface is. This isn't particularly interesting by itself, but when we look at the relative change, it becomes a lot more interesting. And I apologize, these aren't displaying great on this screen. I'm happy to share this with anyone that wants it after the talk, though. On both of these, any areas that are displaying as red had a decrease in greenness that was displaying of more than 20%, and anything that's displaying as green was an increase in greenness of more than 20%. So anything that's red, there was a massive removal of, in all likelihood, vegetation, but all we can say for certain is something that showed as green. Anywhere that is displaying on these maps as green, there was a marked increase in the level of green that was displaying. So some initial things I want to point out to you on this imagery. You can see, particularly in the early time period, right here at the mouth of the Gulf, you see a large clustering of red. That's where Mwanza City is. Particularly in the few decades after Tanzanian independence, that city was growing very, very, very quickly. And that's indicative of the clustering of decrease in greenness as everything got paved. You can see in both images several markings of increase and decrease right around the edge of the lake. That is that annual variation in water hyacinth. So that is at least initial evidence that It comes and goes from year to year. It doesn't always appear in the same places, because if it's there where it wasn't before, it would be showing as green. If it's not there where it was in the previous time, it would be showing as red. And as difficult as some of these images are to see on the screen, you can pretty much trace the edges of the Gulf simply where the change is showing on almost all the shorelines. Most interesting in either of these to me, though, was something I didn't expect, no one had really talked to me about, and hadn't occurred to me until I did this analysis, and that's that all of the water is actually displaying as green. I'm sure that's one of the first things everyone noticed. That means that the lake water itself is visibly at least 20% more green in 2017 than it was in 1999. That's really, really interesting to me. For anyone who wants a little bit deeper analysis of the remote sensing and the band data on a sort of pixel by pixel level, this is simply taking 3 transect lines across various points on the map and returning the spectral signals from the NDVI. So this is a normal range where you wouldn't have significant change at positive or negative. Anywhere it drops below these bottom 2 lines, though, it was a significant decrease. Anywhere it jumps above the top 2 lines, it was a significant increase. And you can see clearly, quantitatively, as the transect lines cross the open water, there's a notable, marked increase in greenness, much more so than anywhere else on most of the landscape, whether we take it at the southern extent, in the middle of the Gulf, or the far northern extent of the Gulf. It's proving true in all 3 instances that the largest collection of increase of greenness is that actual water in the Gulf itself. So across the entire imagery, across the entire study area of about 2,300 square kilometers, this is what I saw in that 1999 to 2017 range. Once the imagery popped out, that really weird, unexpected greenness in the water, this became my focal point of trying to understand what was going on. I also was curious if there was something different going on, because I ran it at a 20% threshold, so I reran the analysis at only a 10% change threshold, and these were the results that I got. This is down to the individual pixel count, the percentage of pixels that displayed change in this time period. We can see that about 23% of pixels showed at least a 20% increase in greenness, and about 22% of those were in the open water. Its pattern is similar when you look at the 10% increase, so it's not a weird artifact or result of the percent change. The pattern holds true at whatever threshold you're looking at for change. So there's definitely something going on here. So my initial conclusions based off of this rudimentary analysis are that, looking at the first point particularly from 84 to 99, the rapid urbanization processes of that city center at the northern edge of the Gulf are resulting in a visible, measurable, observable decrease of greenness on the landscape. There is a quantifiable decrease in the amount of vegetation as a result of the city itself growing. Additionally, my initial point that I wanted to discover and was curious about with the water hyacinth reveals that the cover levels are changing significantly from year to year. If in 1996 it was a big problem for you, it's very likely in 1997 your little corner of the lake may not have had water hyacinth. However, there are consistent presences of it throughout parts of the Gulf. It's just in particular year to year that location is changing. And finally, that greenness in the 1999 to 2017 is because of eutrophication. That's my initial conclusion. It about has to be likely because of agricultural runoff through most of the system. As that city has grown exponentially quickly in the last several decades, those people have to be fed from somewhere, and there has been a massive increase in the amount of agriculture in this area, in this watershed, which is all draining to that Gulf and the larger lake. In particular, because the lake is so shallow, even in the more open water areas, there's still a concentration of the nutrients of the agricultural runoff to cause those algal blooms that are what are popping up as the greenness. So those are my initial conclusions on what's happening in the environment, but I'm not really an environmental scientist. Don't tell my advisor I said that. I'm more concerned about what all of this change means for people living in this community. That's really what I want to get at. That's really what I want to understand. And we can't understand this community of fisheries and the system that was built around the fishery without understanding a little bit of background about what that system looks like and what it's based on. The main fish that is an economically viable product in Lake Victoria is the Nile Perch. This is a photograph of the Nile Perch. It is a very large fish. A full-grown perch will weigh several hundred pounds without any trouble at all. It is an invasive species to the lake. It does not naturally live there. There is no formal record of when it was introduced. They know that it happened at some point during the time that the British held colonies over all three of the Lake Victoria countries. The best theory is that sometime in the late 1950s, the manager of the Uganda Protectorate kicked a bucket of Nile perch into the lake, and the population grew from that. But again, there are no formal records. There's nothing on paper. It's all just rumors and conjecture, but it clearly came from somewhere. As of today, even though it is invasive, it has done exceptionally well in the lake. It has become the apex predator and the dominant species in the lake. It accounts for more than 60% of the total catchment by weight of fish that come out of the lake. And estimates range quite widely for the last few decades, but in general, it's between about 300,000 and 500,000 tons of this fish coming out of the lake every single year. The fish's introduction has had some more impacts, other sorts of changes that I wanted to consider in addition to the broad landscape level environmental change. In particular, something that every single person I talk to wants to talk with me about are the ecological changes. Before the introduction of the perch to this system, Lake Victoria had over 500 species of freshwater cichlids, or in Swahili of furu. Think the kinds of fish you would go buy at PetSmart for $2 because they have pretty colors. But they lived only in Lake Victoria. In the less than 50 years following the introduction of the perch, more than half of those species have completely gone extinct. Another third of them are endangered or threatened because, as you can see, the perch is basically a mouth that swims. It will swallow anything that fits into its mouth, and they are voracious eaters. Again, an individual fish can weigh 200 or 300 pounds, so they eat a lot. In addition to this massive decrease in biodiversity, there's been a significant decrease in the water quality. Everyone wants to tell me about the water quality, and I'm not sure what they mean when they say that, and they can't really elaborate. They just say that the water is worse. I think that's a result of the eutrophication that we're seeing, but people cannot elaborate. They don't understand that the algal growth is what's happening, or maybe they do understand and they're just not able to communicate it to me. But that's something in initial conversations that has been unclear in exactly what people mean when they mention that. It's not been all bad though. The perch has been very beneficial in some terms, particularly economic ones. The gross economic product of that 300,000 to 500,000 tons of fish for Tanzania is between $3 and $4 million annually. That works out to supporting the 35 million people that live in the watershed at between $90 and $270 per year. That does not sound like a lot of money, but these are among the poorest countries on the planet. An additional $90 to $270 per year on top of your other forms of income is a significant increase that will make a marked difference in the things you're able to afford and the things you're going to have access to via your income. A result of that has been a huge influx of people to the cities, including Mwanza City that I'm looking at in this study. which is part of why you see that massive population growth through the 60s, 70s, and 80s that resulted in the massive decrease of greenness and increase of urbanized area in the initial analysis, because everyone wants access to these fisheries. They want to live in the places that the fisheries are based. They want access to this money that comes along with this fish as a product. So these population changes can't be ignored. That I think they are quite significant too. The rural to urban migration has made Mwanza the single major settlement of all of northern Tanzania and has resulted in sustained, almost incomprehensibly significantly fast population growth. In the early 60s, at Tanzanian and Tanganyikan independence, Mwanza was a relatively small fishing village of about 50,000 people, and today its population is above 2 million. So that's really, really significant fast growth. And this is just a picture of the central city, downtown Mwanza. This is not particularly impressive on a global scale, but this is a relatively young African city with multiple skyscrapers of 6, 7, 8 stories, which again, in this region, is something that even 20 years ago was relatively unheard of. So, taking all of that information, combined with what I saw with the remote sensing environmental change information, I wanted to analyze it in something that I felt a lot more comfortable with, that I've been trained in. I'm trained as an economic geographer, so one of the first questions I ask every single time, what does whatever that system mean, that systems change mean for employment? How do people work? How do people's lives change in a system like this? So that's exactly what I've asked. How are employment patterns and opportunities in this fishery system being influenced by these changes that everyone wants to talk about, by this quantifiable environmental change that I've observed? So my methodology here was what most of us probably do with a lot of our work. It was to do a significant number of interviews. What I'm talking about today is based on 37 key informant interviews from 2014 during my initial dissertation reconnaissance work with people from the widest range of parts of the fishing sector that I was able to interact with. In those 37 interviews, I talked to 18 men, 19 women, tried to keep the gender balance as equal as possible. However, this is an incredibly gendered system, and people that do different jobs are either men or women. There's not really any exceptions to that. The women exclusively work as the middle step in the product chain, as the processors that take the raw fish product from the fishers, gut it, dry it, salt it, prepare it to go to market. So I talked to 19 processors, and again, those were all women. And then the men are either working as the sellers at the final point in market, as the fishmongers. I was able to talk with 7 of them. And then the remaining 11 people, again, all male, were actually fishers that were going out on the boats with nets and rods to catch these fish. The initial things that were revealed to me from these interviews is that, contrary to what you might expect in an ever-increasing globalizing world and an ever-increasing globalized market, that there was actually a big decrease in the number of people working with the large international firms. There are several Russian, Indian, and Belgian firms that come in, hire locals. They're not legally allowed to trawl the lake, but essentially trawl the lake to catch these fish and then send them back to Russia, back to India, at points back to the EU, although this fish has not always been legal for export to the EU. At the time period it has been, it's been going there as well. But most people are shying away and starting to move away from those firms and going into business for themselves, working for locals. Less and less people want to work for those international firms. In fact, nearly everyone I talked to, whatever part of the industry they work in, whatever part of the product chain they're involved in, is starting their own business, is going into business for themselves. The fishers are buying their own boats and nets. The processors are establishing their own business and using their capital and human connections to do things for themselves. as are the fishmongers selling at market. The most interesting thing to me here as a geographer is that this has been an explicitly geographic trend as well. As people start their own businesses, there is an exodus from the city center. They're not only economically fleeing and leaving the international firms behind, they are doing so geographically as well. They're getting as far away from the international firms in the city center at the city's main dock as they can. The movement of this industry as a whole outside of the city contrasts with every other general thing that we know about urban growth and urbanization, is that everything clusters in the city center and centers around this. So it's a really interesting contrast to what you'd expect to see as an industry grows in tandem with the city. So these are the 5 largest docks or landing sites in the larger Mwanza metropolitan area. Just to orient you, really this is the city, but the city center that I showed you the photograph of is right there. And this, of course, is the mouth of Mwanza Gulf. Everybody remember this picture? So this was taken right there in the city center, near Nyamanga, the main commercial landing site and docks in Mwanza. What people are telling me, what I'm observing, where I had to go to talk to people, is as far away from that as possible. There's no real pattern if people are going to the north or to the south. They're going in both directions. But Pasiansi and Ilimera in the north, and Nyegezi and points further south are where most people are doing business now. The international firms are still there in the city center. People are still working for them, but the growth in this market, and increasingly even people that are historically working for them, are going into their own businesses and locating themselves further away from the international businesses, the international fishing firms, which is interesting because no one's fishing the Gulf. They have to go into the lake to catch this fish. So they're all going the same place. Other than simply not having to see and interact with those firms, not having to compete with them for landing sites or slips at the dock, there's no logical economic reason why they're doing this. So, unfortunately, that's the point I'm at right now. I'm still working on my dissertation. There are several things I want to work on as I continue this process and move beyond dissertation into postdoctoral, whatever comes next. I want to do some expanded remote sensing analyses beyond the basic index-based things that I've done now. In particular, things like a tassel cap transformation that would do more than just reveal greenness on the landscape. It would give me some more complex ideas of what the brightness, the darkness, the greenness, the yellowness, to not only have an idea of presence or absence of vegetation, but health of vegetation, amount of built-up area, things like that. I'm also curious, beyond just this Gulf, what's going on. So using a different satellite, a different sensor, to use different imagery such as MODIS imagery that is at a much larger spatial scale to look at the entire lake system is something I definitely plan to do. But more significantly than that, I need more field-based verification. I haven't been able, through funding and all of the difficulties I'm sure we're all unfortunately aware of, to go back and conduct research in any measured way since 2014. So seeing not only what's happened since then, but what people can tell me now that I have a better idea of the picture and what's going on is the necessary next step. Tied to looking at the lake as a whole, I'm also curious in expanding the study to comparative sites in Kenya and Uganda. And I am happy to say that I am going to be able to do that in Kenya because starting this January, I have a Fulbright fellowship to go to Kenya for a year and continue this research to see what's going on in Kisumu and the large city on the Kenyan shore, see if it is similar to Mwanza, if there's a measured difference, if the fact that it's a different state is playing a different role, or if there's a similar sort of thing going on in that location. So obviously, this is very much work in progress. I would very much welcome any questions, comments, ideas, suggestions, or any other helpful words I can't think of right now from anyone in the room that has them to offer. Thank you so much for coming.